Hey everyone, we're going to take a quick first look at the Twin Ogron encounter in Highmaul. Obviously, all the footage we use and everything we know about the fight is based on our beta experiences, so everything is subject to change. In the Twin Ogron encounter, you will face two bosses simultaneously, Pol and Femos. The bosses do not share health, and at least in theory, you need to kill them around the same time because when one dies, the other boss will enrage. On the beta, the enrage was not exactly prohibitive, but it is presumed that on live servers it will be so. An important element of this fight is the proximity of the two bosses to one another. According to the Dungeon Journal, as the distance between the two Ogron increases, their haste increases, and their casting time therefore decreases, reducing the amount of time players have to react to various abilities. Whether this will remain unchanged in the final version remains to be seen, but it does show a concern from Blizzard as to the positioning of the two bosses relative to one another. This means that strategies involving stacking them together or keeping them very far apart will have their own drawbacks and disadvantages, and some might even be made unfeasible. The two bosses each have an energy bar that gradually fills up over time. At 33%, 66%, and 100% energy respectively, each boss will cast a specific ability. On the beta, the two energy bars of the bosses were not perfectly synchronized, although it did appear that at some point later on in the fight, they did end up synchronizing. This is obviously subject to change and we can't tell how it will be in the final version, but it's probably likely that they will be perfectly synchronized. It's also worth noting that the energy is not expended when an ability is cast. Therefore, the energy bar is really only there to indicate when an ability cast is about to come, and not a resource that needs to be managed. So, let's look at the abilities. At 33 energy, Femos casts Whirlwind. Essentially, this causes him to spin around for a short duration, dealing damage to everyone around him. He still follows his tank, so the tank just needs to make sure that Femos doesn't end up in the raid. When reaching 33 energy, Pol, the other boss, casts Shield Charge. He charges the player that is furthest from him, dealing damage to everyone in that path and also dealing damage when he arrives at his destination. Obviously, this is another mechanic that should not traverse the raid stack. Normally, it will either target the tank of the other boss, or it will target a designated player who stands at range with a damage mitigation cooldown just to attract the shield charge. At 66 energy, Femos casts Enfeebling Roar. This ability affects all players within 20 yards of the boss, splitting a 300% damage taken increase among them. This damage taken increase lasts for 300 seconds, but this duration is also split among the affected targets. In effect, this means that if the entire raid is stacked on the boss when Enfeebling Roar is cast, then everyone will only receive a small damage taken increase for a small amount of time. At 66 energy, Pol casts Interrupting Shout. This will interrupt and lock out any players that are in the middle of a spellcast when it happens, and it also deals some physical damage to all enemies. Finally, at 100 energy, Femos casts Quake. He throws down his weapons at locations on the ground, inflicting damage to all players, and then from each weapon, several moving waves of fire spawn. These waves travel in almost erratic patterns along the floor, and anyone who comes into contact with them will be damaged, and they will have a stacking fire dot applied to them. They simply need to be avoided. At 100 energy, Pol casts Pulverize. This is a 3-stage ability. In the first stage, Pulverize causes each player to deal damage to anyone within 3 yards of them, so the raid needs to spread out a bit in preparation. The second phase of Pulverize causes chunks of the ceiling to fall at designated locations on the ground, dealing damage to anyone within 8 yards of them. These simply need to be avoided by players. And finally, in its third phase, Pulverize causes a large chunk of the ceiling to fall in one location. This deals raid-wide damage, but players will take more damage the closer they are to the impact location. Again, players will have to run away from this location or use damage mitigation cooldowns. Obviously, the abilities of the two bosses will overlap, causing certain confusion in the raid, but this is ultimately another fight that requires a regular and precise stacking and spreading from the raid. As the fight comes closer to completion, and as Warlords of Draenor comes closer to launch, you will be able to find a complete written guide for this boss fight and all other boss fights on our website.